Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Black Hat, for inviting us and giving us this amazing opportunity to present our work. I'm Eliot Bendinelli. I'm a technologist at Privacy International, and this is my ex-colleague, Frederike Kaltheuner, who's now a Mozilla fellow, but we did this research together, so it kind of makes sense that we present it together. So a quick note about the organization I work for, Privacy International. So we're a London-based charity. We've been here for about 30 years, and we fight governments and corporates on human rights and technology subjects. So we basically advocate for technology that works for people, enable people, rather than works against us. So we've got different type of actions. We do litigation, we do research, we do advocacy, and this project was made as part of an effort within a larger topic, which is corporate exploitation of data, and we'll jump right into it.
So why are we looking into the topic of tracking, and why have we focused on mental health websites specifically? According to the World Health Organization, 25% of the European population have experienced depression in the past year. Of those people, only 50% of severe depressions get treated. We think that collectively we really need to change the way we talk about mental health, remove the stigma, and opening up to friends and family can be really, really important for getting help. That said, if advertisers, data brokers, and online tracking companies know that you are depressed, and when exactly you are depressed, this is not just highly intrusive, but this is also information that can be used against you. So the reason why we did this research, I have to go a while back. So ever since the GDPR entered into force, everyone here in this room will have been blessed with consent forms on the vast majority of websites that they visit. What these consent forms have in common is that they're very often designed to be deceptive, they're incredibly annoying, and it is often a lot more difficult to not consent than it is to consent. This is clearly not in the spirit of the law. Nonetheless, very few people know what happens when you actually do click accept, that every one of us does from time to time, because it's simply nobody has time to actually opt out, especially when it's being made so difficult. So we did exactly that. I clicked accept on a number of these tracking forms by a company called Quantcast, and then I wrote a data subject access request, that's a right under GDPR, a data right to Quantcast in order to get access to all of my data that the company has. Here's what we find out. What you see here is a deliberately blurred version of my browsing history. Don't try to reverse engineer, it's not my real browsing history, but it just shows how much data a single cookie placed by a single company on a single browser can accumulate over time. So those are URLs I've visited. Those are not just journalistic websites I've visited, which can reveal a lot about the research and work I've been doing at that time, but also restaurant booking reservations, train bookings, flight reservations, where you can see exactly where I'm flying to and from with children, with which class, etc. But that was only one part of the data that I received. The second part that I received back in my access request from Quantcast are a statistical analysis, so inferences, assumptions about who I am, so who this browser is. It's my age, my gender, whether I have children, and my level of education. And the third slide, which I thought was most fascinating, was this one. So in this access request, we also received data, the segments, the marketing segment that this particular browser has been placed in. And what's so fascinating about it are a number of things. First of all, you can really see how an access request from a single online tracking company, namely Quantcast, returned data from a whole network of data brokers and advertisement companies. We see data brokers in here. We also see MasterCard. We see Oracle. We see Experian, a credit referencing agency company. And this research inspired us to not just further investigate, but to also file complaints against 7 companies in the data broker and ad tech technology ecosystem. So in November 2018, we filed complaints against Axiom, Criteo, Equifax, Experian, Oracle, Quantcast, and Tapad. Some of these investigations are ongoing, but Quantcast is, as a direct consequence of this complaint, Quantcast is now under investigation by the Irish Data Protection Commissioner. So this is the context in which we decided, well, we looked at these companies in the abstract, but all of this is very hard to communicate why it actually matters. Why does it matter that I'm being tracked by advertising companies? Why does it matter that a lot of this data exchanges hands? Which is why we decided to do further research into exactly what happens when you're looking for information about depression online. And we obviously picked depression because being depressed is something that's very intimate. And also from a legal perspective, information relating to health qualifies as a special category data under GDPR. So this is the research design. We selected 136 popular mental health web pages, and you'll hear the word web pages more frequently because some websites had several web pages in our research. We focused on 3 countries, France, Germany, and the UK. And the goal was really to understand how many third parties trackers are present on these websites and what data is being shared. For those who don't know, what's a third party? How do we find it for the purpose of this research? So there are many reasons why apps or websites decide to integrate third-party code. Not all of them are nefarious, and some are incredibly useful, from fonts to analytic services. So for the purpose of this research, we define third parties as any entity that the website contacts. However, we also made a distinction then in our research on between different kinds of third-party tracking. We made a distinction between different purposes and different technologies that were being used.
So looking at how we picked up this 136 websites, this might seem like a small sample, but the idea was to get something that was relevant to people, something you could really relate to. So the way we did it is we used Google Trend to find the most typed queries, the related queries to the word depression in the 3 languages of the 3 countries we studied. So we used Google Trend, find 5 related queries, and then we hop into a VPN. We locate ourselves in the country where we want to do the research, geolocate the version of Google, so we make sure we're using google.fr in France, and we run these queries. So this gives a basic result of like Google search. So you have 10 links, some are featured, some are advertising, so paid links. We take all of this, we store it into a file, and we add it to the mix the top 5 websites related to mental health, because the goal is really to analyze the websites that are driving the most traffic related to this type of issues. So this is what it looks like. This is France. You can see some are advertising links, some are featured. So feature, if you don't know exactly what it is, it's like this top link that Google thinks is the most relevant. It might be sometimes twice in the results page, but we just wanted to mark that down so we knew what we were looking at. Okay, now we have the pages we want to look at. What do we do? The first tool we used is something called WebX-Ray. It's an open source software. It's developed by Tim Liebert, who's a researcher. And it's basically a Python script that runs the headless version of Chrome in your terminal. And what it does, it opens this headless version of Chrome. It visits all of the web pages that you have listed, and it records all of the interaction that your browser is having with this website, and all of the third-party elements that are being loaded. So whether it's cookies, JavaScript, or just images or font, basically every interaction that is happening when you're visiting this page. The second thing that this tool does, which was really helpful, is provide some sort of analysis. So it takes all of this data that it has scrapped, and it turns it into useful information, like how many trackers, or what percentage of trackers were present on all of the website analyzed. So I can show you what this looks like. It's this cute, tiny little terminal tool. So you can see I just want to collect data. I can create a new database. These are the list of the websites. So they're classified by country. And then you just launch it. It adds the URLs, and it starts the version of Chrome, and it's going to visit the pages. So The really interesting point to remember here is that this is a headless version of Chrome. So there is no interaction happening at any time. Like the page never opens. And that's something to keep in mind when we'll tell you about the results. The second part of it is the analysis. So you just pick up one of the database that you've used to scrape all of these websites, and it generates a set of little CSVs with that type of data. So we have, this was the French data set, I believe. So you can see that Google Analytics was present on 68% of the websites, double click on 60%. So this already gives you an insight of the type of information we found. So okay, that's nice. That's a lot of queries. That's a lot of stuff going on. But what is actually in these queries? Like, what about the content? So the second thing we did is we wanted to focus a smaller subset of websites where users are actually imputing some information that are really personal. So we decided to go for depression tests. The first reason is because it was some of the most typed queries related to depression. And the second is it's a perfect example of an individual entering information that are personal to, that are related to themselves, and we want to know what happened to this. So, like I said, we took a really small subset to run this second part of the research, and we only looked at 3 depression test websites per country. But there was a lot of work to do, so this kind of makes sense. And the tool we used to do this is a little tool called HTTP Toolkit. It is initially something made for developers, web developers who want to inspect the queries their website are doing or their APIs. It can have different use. Open source tool again, and basically what this does, compared to, say, Firefox or Chrome, is that it also does a man-in-the-middle attack. So you have a certificate that you add, and it allows you to inspect like all of the post queries that the website you're visiting is sending. So we thought that was a good way for us to see what was going on between a web page we are visiting and a server that might be communicating with. So what we did, once we see all of the queries, that's where it might be a lot of work. We look at all of the post requests, try to see what kind of data is being sent. We try to search for keywords. So if you're answering yes or a specific word to one of the questions in the test, we look for this in some of the queries, see if something is being sent to someone. At the time, we used URL decoder just to make the argument in the GET request more readable. Since then, the software has been improved, and there is a way to see all of the arguments. It's really neat. I really appreciate that. And finally, when it was relevant, we had a look at the cookies in Firefox and Chrome, just to see if some of the IDs that were stored in these cookies were the same as some in the GET and POST requests. So again, this is what it looks like. So this is HTTP Toolkit. That's the website we're looking at. It's depression test. It's got the question and answers. And when I say this took a lot of work, you can see here we've got about 200 requests, and that's just me loading the web page. So we would take the test, and for some of this website, at the end, we had like 2,000 requests to analyze. So yeah, we tried to do our best to find what was interesting and going on. And again, this gives you a good idea of what is going on, how many third parties, and like basically how modern websites works these days. Not all of them, hopefully. So I think what we found, I think this is you going back on stage.
So here's what we found out in this research. The first major and most important finding is that popular websites on mental health share users' personal data with third parties. And we also found that some depression tests share test answers and results with third parties as well. I'm going to unpack this a little bit going forward. So the very first finding is actually not a surprise. We found that 97.78% of all the web pages we analyzed contained a third-party element. As we said previously, containing or contacting a third-party element is not necessarily nefarious. That said, it does come with an inherent privacy risk. Typically, what is being communicated to a third party is that a very specific browser contacts a very specific URL. In the case of mental health websites, it's quite typical that the URL reveals a lot of information. So the URLs we looked at could mean something like, I am feeling depressed, looking for help, etc. So communicating that to so many third parties does come with an inherent risk. especially when lots of additional browser information is being shared that could be used for fingerprinting. Here's the second finding, which I thought was very fascinating. So due to the research design, all of the third-party elements, including cookies that we detected, were detected without any sort of user interaction. That means any cookies that we detected that were placed have been placed before you were able to consent or not consent. The average cookie per website in France was 44.49, 7.82 for Germany, and 12.24 in the UK. So just as a reminder, all of these were placed before users can agree or disagree or consent. Here's what this looks like in practice. I'm going to show you the website of Doctissimo.fr. It's one of the largest health websites in France. So if you go to Doctissimo.fr, you see a very non-intrusive, which is obviously appreciated, but also deceptive. You see a very low bar that says do you want to accept or more information, basically. Any movement of the cursor leads to this box disappearing, and this is interpreted as consent. Just as a reminder, that's not what we did in our study. There was no cursor movement. But as a user, as soon as you do anything on the website, the box disappears, and this is interpreted as your consent. After you have quote-unquote consented, Doctissimo shares data with a select number of trusted partners. We've mentioned the exact number in our report. I believe it's way more than 500. But to illustrate how this looks like, so this is what you can see if you bother to click 5 clicks and see what exactly is shared and with whom. So this is an astonishing large amount of third parties for a health website. So as I said before, not all third-party elements are nefarious, but our research shows that the primary purpose that websites use third parties is marketing. So 76% of the websites we analyzed contained a third-party tracker for marketing purposes. This is a classification that WebXray does. They classify trackers according to different purposes they were set. What's also interesting about this, I think you could argue, well, I just need to monetize my website. And I'd love to have a longer discussion about this in the Q&A. But what's fascinating is that we found countless of websites that include trackers from known data brokers, and companies that do programmatic advertisement, where data is broadcast to a large number of third parties, which is subject to a number of complaints already. So the companies we found were AppNexus, Criteo, Outbrain, LiveRamp, former Axiom company, Oracle, and Taboola. And finally, which is probably also not a surprise, is that big tech companies are present, are the most common trackers, both on mobile and on websites. And our study confirmed this. We left out Amazon Web Services, but we also measured that. So we found both Google, Facebook, and Amazon are present on these websites, sometimes because they offer services like analytics or web hosting, but also for marketing purposes. So Amazon Marketing Services was very present, particularly in France, DoubleClick in the UK, and in France as well. So all of this was done with WebXray, but Eliot is now going to explain some of our findings on depression tests, which was a subset of websites that we analyzed in further detail.
So for us, this is where the fun begins. Like I said, the idea of the section is take a test like any normal person would do, probably in a moment of maybe not despair, but where they're feeling a little bit, sorry, I can't find my words here, but not in a pleasant moment, let's say. And it's just to illustrate what could happen if you just Google depression test and you take a test. So we had 9 websites. 4 of them gave interesting results. The 5 others were they didn't provide anything particularly interesting. The first one I want to look at is Passeport Santé. So Passeport Santé is also a big French website when it comes to health information. They're always very high in the search results. And this is what happens when you take a test on their websites. So this is the URL at the end of the test. You can see R1 equals 0, R2 equals 0, R3 equals 1. As you can already imagine, those are basically the answers to each question I took. Q equals 12 just means that I'm on the last question, and resulta equals 1 just means that it's the last page. So why is this interesting? First, why do you store depression test results in the URL? You have to explain to me. I don't know. Because basically, this URL is going to be shared with all of your third parties, because that's the URL referrer. And this is, if you haven't taken any step to remove this from the GET request that's going to go to all of your third parties, all of these guys, who you might or might not want to receive these results, are going to have access to this. Which is why I put this little thing. It's really real estate. Like, if you put a little bit of effort, if you're looking at the logs and things that are coming to your server, and you see this, and you're like, oh, depression, tests, this looks like questions and results. Hey, that's useful information. And what's interesting is, like, some of these companies have cookies and unique identifiers on the websites, so they know it's you. And if you've been browsing our website, they can link this information to everything else you've been doing. So exactly what Frederike was showing with Concast. So that was the first finding. Second website that was interesting was depression.org.nz. So this is actually a national website from New Zealand. And yeah, they're basically doing the same thing, but they're going a little bit further because they're putting the score at the end. So 23, that was a random test. I'm just randomly clicking, but it's quite high. So again, all of these people are just receiving this information for free. Oh, that's nice. Someone took a self-test, depression test, and their score was 23. Huh, interesting. So, I mean, I don't even think there's debate here that this is personal information, but we can talk about that in the end. And so my favorite one was Doctissimo, which we already showed before. They're the ones with the constant banner disappearing as soon as you start scrolling. So what they did is, like, they didn't put anything in URL. They just sent it in clear text to a third party that is not mentioned anywhere on their website. So this is qualifio.com, and this is a post request. So I first saw this, so you could see response with a unique ID, question number 5. Okay, this looks like the question I just answered. But I might need a bit more information. This looks like, yeah, the unique identifier of the answer. And this is what is the response from Qualifio. So it's actually cut here, but this is the complete question. You can see my answer label faux. And this is getting interesting, actually, because there is a correct answer. So it's a depression test, but you don't have the correct answer. So I'll show you this right after. At the end of the test, this shows you kind of how much they don't care. It tells you which answer you got right and the one you got false. And again, this is a depression test. This is something personal. But this kind of shows that they haven't put much thinking into this. They're just sending the answer to, again, a company that is not mentioned anywhere. They have, like, yeah, about 500 partners that they share data with, but Qualifio is never mentioned, even though it's in clear text. So in case you didn't notice, this is HTTP, so no TLS. And this is associated, again, with a unique identifier. I don't have a screenshot here, but it definitely sets a unique identifier for each person taking the test. So, yeah, and finally, the not so bad NHS. I'm not willing so much to hit them on the head, but they were also sending the total score of the test you were taking on their website to a OMTRDC website, which is actually an Adobe Analytics server. And so you could, we had to dig a little bit into the documentation to make sure that this is what it was. And looking at the NHS privacy policy, you can see that they were actually saying we're recording this sort of information for our own personal analytics. But we were still a little bit disappointed because there was no warning. Good thing is they removed it. So we've been running tests to check because basically we did right of response to this company. We wrote to them telling them we think there is a problem with your website and there's probably something you can fix. So the NHS fixed it, Doctissimo and the New Zealand website didn't do anything, and Passport Santé removed the page, because that's how you fix a problem. You just remove it. But yeah, it's still good to see that some people can actually fix things, and you can make a proper depression test that just doesn't share all of the results with everybody. So let's see. Yeah, why it cares?
Why does any of this matter? I mean, it's clearly poor website design, but what's the bigger picture here? I think the first point that's really worthwhile pointing out is that we barely scratched the surface. So we did a broad scan of 139 web pages, but we only closer investigated 9 websites. And there we already found horribly designed tests. So there's a lot more out there that we haven't looked at. The second point is we are also technically limited in what we can observe. There might be websites that look perfectly fine to us that are still collecting a lot of data. And then finally, I think the very nature of the ad tech ecosystem and how it operates means that we are only ever seeing the data that is being collected. We do not have access to the backend. We don't know how data is being shared and aggregated and how it changes hands. So everything you could see in my access request from Quantcast might or might not be happening in the background here, and we're just unable to see it. I mean, the second reason why this matters is many of our findings are very clear violation of GDPR and in the e-privacy. So with some very limited exceptions, you need consent to place cookies or similar technologies on a browser. And many people are confusing this with the annoying consent boxes that you're being bombarded with every day, but that's actually not in the spirit of the law. What the law says is that consent has to be specific, informed, unambiguous, and freely given. This means no pre-tick boxes, no deceptive dark pattern design that nudges you to click yes, but a very, very clear choice. And something that I'm personally an advocate for would be why don't you respect my browser signals that say I don't want to be tracked, for instance? That would be the clearest or easiest way to comply. So all of the cookies that have been placed in this study have been placed in a way that is not compliant with the law. The second element to this is, so health data, personal data relating to health is a special category of data. It's in the same category as biometric information, information about your political beliefs, trade union memberships, your sexual orientation. So there's a higher bar for the processing of this data. You're only allowed to process this data, again with some limited exceptions, with the explicit consent of users, meaning you need to be very explicit about why you're collecting it and for what purposes. So in all of the depression tests, there was some behavior that we observed that is clearly in violation of this. If you're taking a depression test and the way in which the test is designed, you can be uniquely identified, and this data is being shared with anyone, you need to give your explicit consent to do this, otherwise it's not allowed. But there's a third reason why this matters. I realize the image is now a bit of a mismatch with the text. So the reason why it matters that this data enters the ecosystem, the ad tech ecosystem, is that knowing who is depressed and when means that you can be targeted when you're most vulnerable. And I kept this image because the example that I keep on coming back to, the worst case scenarios, we've seen anti-choice groups in the US target, quote unquote, abortion-minded women while they're in a clinic to seek an appointment. So this is sort of like what this kind of tracking and targeting allows. And I want to show you some of the actual ads that I have received after we did this research on my own Instagram. So this is your brain on anxiety. Do you struggle with procrastination? I've also received tests, I couldn't find the screenshots anymore, for like, get a therapist online. And as helpful as it is, if I was actually depressed, it would be very helpful that this information reaches me. But we know that the ad ecosystem is so complex that there are always bad actors who have very other intentions in mind. And I'm not sure, this is a little bit gendered as well. So if you're a woman on the internet at a certain age, you're being bombarded with ads about diets, with ads about anything like plastic surgery, do you hate your job? And sort of like those are some of the reasons in which knowing that somebody is depressed could be used against them. Those are actual ads that people I know have seen. Finally, of course, all of this raises security questions because a lot of personal data changes hands in the ad tech ecosystem. As I mentioned earlier, there are a number of complaints that are being filed about programmatic advertisement, and data security is one of the key arguments they make in their legal complaints. But I also keep coming back to this example because I find it very fascinating. So right after the time that President Trump indulged with the idea of a Muslim database, Amnesty International So a government database. Amnesty International wanted to find out how easy it would be to actually already create such a database based on data broker data. And they found out that for 7.5 cents per person, so $138,880, they were able to create a database of all Muslims in the United States. And I say quote-unquote Muslims, there's no guarantee that this data is even correct. But so these are assumptions about what somebody's religion is. And it's interesting to come back to this because in some of the websites, there were data broker trackers. And data brokers, we don't know what they're doing with the data. But we clearly know that they're in the business of collecting and aggregating and sharing and selling data. Finally, and I think this is really important, the ways in which these websites are designed, and we did research previously on apps, not specifically on mental health, undermines trust in technology that could be incredibly useful. There are incredibly useful apps about mental health. If you're struggling with depression, you should go online and seek help. But the fact that these websites are designed in a way that shares so much data risks undermining people's trust. And the worst outcome that I could think of is that people stop seeking help when they need to. That said, a lot of the tests were quite, I would say, not necessarily scientifically rigorous. And finally, we only looked at websites and cookies, so we looked at technology from the 90s almost, and we know that technology is changing very quickly. We now have Internet of Things devices that also have trackers embedded, and we now move towards a world where we have emotion recognition technology that is also designed to detect whether you're happy or sad. So I think there's a broader discussion here to be had. How do we want our emotions to be treated? How do we want the fact that we're not feeling well? Who should have access to this and who shouldn't?
Yeah, and just to jump onto this last point, already in the things that we observed, there are technologies that are quite intrusive. So one of the third party that we detected on the NHS website the first time around the scan was Hotjar. And for those who don't know Hotjar, they offer a certain number of tools, and one of them is session recording and session replay, so that you can see what your users are doing on the website. It's not for all of your users, obviously, but it's something that happens without people knowing. You don't have a big pop-up saying, from now on, your mouse is going to be recorded, and some people might watch it to see which button you prefer to click. But on a depression test, that was a bit scary. So let's talk a little bit about the future and how do we fix this. The first step is respect your users. We've been talking a little bit already about consent, but really, like the deeper thinking here is when you're setting up a website, when you're thinking about a business model online that is web-based or app-based, don't be this unicorn that is just like, oh, if we fail, we're just going to send a user's database to someone and they'll be fine. And it's personal data. A lot of people want this. Data broker want this. People doing machine learning want this. No, that's not how it works. That's not the internet you want. That's not when a family member or a friend go on a depression website. You don't want them to just be feeding into this industry of personal data. So that's one thing. The second thing, if you are a developer, rethink a little bit what you're doing. Sure, I'm sure half of the websites we looked at have good intentions. They want to provide a useful service. They want to be helpful to people looking for information. And yet, they have double-click trackers. And we can understand from a certain point of view that they want to make money with their service and they might want to run ad. But like we've mentioned previously, a lot of these websites are running programmatic advertising, which means it is literally about targeting your users, about knowing who is visiting this web page at this exact moment so that people can bid. For those who are not familiar with it, one of the methods that is used in programmatic advertising these days is called RealTime Bidding. And it is literally bidding. It's like, I have these people visiting my website right now. This is everything I know about them. I've got this advertising space. Who wants to put money and get this? And it's a whole ecosystem. It's a whole system. There's a lot of data coming into it. So it's not only what you're doing, but if there is a company that says, oh, I know this ID, this cookie ID. Here is everything I know about him. Here is the segments that we've seen before. And this is being shared with hundreds of companies who are like, yeah, I'm willing to put money, I'm willing to bid that much money so that this person will see my ad. And you have to take this into account. In the same way that when you're the NHS and you're using an Adobe Analytics server, you have to let your users know if you're collecting their data. And so there are these two aspects that on the one end, you have to explain to your users what you're doing, but on the other end, you just have to think in the first place, why am I doing this? Does this make sense? Is it okay if I store all of the results of a test in a URL? Like, what are the consequences of doing something like this on a website?
And we concluded our research by saying there's no place for programmatic advertisement on mental health websites because it's like an inherently intrusive advertising practice, and health websites inherently share sensitive data.
The next message we have is you can replicate this. This is really, technically speaking, it's not too complicated. Methodology is open. It's on a website. Anyone can access it, can replicate. The FT, the Financial Times, did exactly the same thing about 2 weeks ago. They made the front page with it. The creator of WebX-Ray did something on porn websites before we released our research. So, and we're in touch with a lot of journalists that find this topic interesting because you can do it on other types of web page, and you can get a sense of how the web is working today. The other thing is that if you have other information, we said before, we're only scratching the surface here. We're only looking at what's happening in our browser. But if you are in charge of servers, if you're a publisher, if you have access to a huge network and you can see what's happening behind all of this, behind the scene, it's also maybe time to speak up and to look at what's going on, what type of data is being shared. Is it actually fair? Is it legitimate? Is it even legal? So this is a good opportunity for us when we're talking to a tech literate community like yours to raise this type of questions. The other thing is like file complaints. So we've contacted Doctissimo about their depression test. They never answered. At this point, we're like, you're just infringing the law, and we need law enforcement. This is actually the first step. We need regulators to take action. And you can do this too. If you go on a website and you feel like they're not respecting your rights, there are templates on the ICO websites. You can file a complaint. Just put some pressure on them. And yeah, if you want to.
You can find the whole report that we published on the websites of privacyinternational.org. So it contains all of our findings, the methodology, and we've also shared the data so you can replicate the research. But I also wanted to give a very quick shout out to the Financial Times that published a really interesting research that builds on this 2 weeks ago called How Top Health Websites Are Sharing Sensitive Data with Advertisers. And we would also like to thank HTTPS Toolkit and WebX-Ray. Without open source tools like these, we couldn't have done the research.
So if you have any questions, now it's time to jump in. And thank you for listening.
Hi there. So there's clearly a lot of things that web developers can do on their end in order to ensure that personal data isn't shared in an inappropriate way. What can the average person as an end user do to ensure that their personal information isn't being shared, especially on sites like this where they're pretty much doing it automatically? There's no input on your end.
I'm going to jump in first, and then Eliot can give the proper answer. I think it's like, in no other industry do we place so much responsibility and burden on the end user to protect themselves. And I think cookie banners are a great reminder. Nobody has time to click no every single time. They're designed to be deceptive. And what we're ultimately fighting for is, like, we need some legal enforcement that changes this, basically. That said, the second point I want to make, we talk about websites. If you, at CCC, I presented work with a colleague on tracking that happens in apps, and there's no way to protect. I mean, there is a very complicated technical way, but for the average person, there's no way to protect yourself from third-party tracking in apps. So it is incredibly difficult to protect yourself effectively, and that's a real problem. That said, there are a few things that we recommend you do.
Yeah, I wouldn't even go up to say that we recommend, but there are ways, like even using an ad blocker, actually, you're blocking a lot of advertising third-party servers. So if you're using uBlock Origin or Privacy Badger, or if you're using things like Disconnect, Ghosteries, there are a few browser extensions that are basically going to limit the how to say that, the number of requests that can go out to potentially dangerous third parties. But like Frederike said, there is no perfect answer. When it comes to Doctissimo sending something to Qualifio in a post request with your answers in clear text, I mean, Qualifio maybe just do a random test for BuzzFeed to test which Disney princess you are. You can block them. They might be, you might find it useful. So most of the time, if you go down that road, you're just going to block everything, and the web is going to be unusable.
But the general advice is block ads, delete your cookies, reset your ideas. While tracking has become more complicated, it still mostly relies on cookies and cookie syncing. This would be the basic.
Yeah, I warn you, it's going to be painful.
The Brave browser had some audience member option. Is an option as well. Mozilla offers some good products as well.
Yeah.
There was a question here in the front. We're waiting. Wait a second.
It was the same thing. Okay.
The same question.
No, I think it's good.
Are there any other questions, complaints, jokes?
So I was curious to what extent you all think from your research that advertisers are actually capable of, like, from a financial perspective and an interest perspective, of actually like looking into granular data like quiz results, or if this is more of a potential threat than a realized one.
I think this is an excellent question, and you're totally right, as in the problem about talking about this issue is the fact that it's being shared doesn't mean that it's being used. And when you confront companies, their response is usually, we don't analyze the data. The problem, though, is that we need to blindly trust them that they don't. And I think that's an inherent power imbalance that's built into this, which is problematic. And we've seen there have been so many scandals in the last year that sort of suggest that we can't blindly trust companies to do the right thing. I think that would be my first answer. And the second one is, so the idea of you need to have ads to monetize your website. When you bring this to companies, their response is usually, well, we have two choices. Either we let people pay and they don't want to pay, or we show them completely irrelevant ads, and there's only one thing that people hate more than tracking, it's bad advertisement. And that's a false dichotomy, which is simply not true, because it ignores the fact that over the past decade, the data that feeds into advertisement has become exponentially more invasive. It's one thing to show ads and target them a little bit. It's something entirely different. And I think I love the slide, sort of like the Quantcast data in the back end. That's an entirely different game. It's like what's currently happening is online and offline data is being merged. There's cross-device, cross-browser tracking. So the idea is that everything you do online and increasingly offline needs a trace and feeds into data. When we all know that the ads are still irrelevant to us, that's just disproportionate. And we need to have a conversation. It's like, how can we have advertisement, but this amount of data that's being used is just excessive.
So I've got two things to add to this. The first one is, when it comes to things such as Qualifio receiving the answers, we don't know what this company does. Like, are they providing this test for free? Are they just a hosting company? We have no clue. So maybe it's their whole business model. We don't know about that. When it comes to things in URL, I'm on your side. It might be just it's a mistake, and it might require efforts to take advantage of it. But another thing we haven't covered here, but we saw when we were using HTTP Toolkit and inspecting requests, is that this real-time bidding thing I talked about.
Yes.
You could see some example of pre-bid requests, so something that is about to go into the whole system. And in there, you could see all of the keywords. And like literally, this is not just about information about the page, but everything that, it's a lot of information about the page actually, and also about the user. And this
the keywords in that case would be depression, test, mental health, therapy, psychology. And as an advertiser, you can bid on these keywords, which is sort of which just says that information about uniquely identifiable people linked to these keywords are being sold in the advertising ecosystem.
So it is being used, basically.
Yeah. And then finally, there was a case when Grindr, the gay dating app, there was a scandal when a third party when people's HIV, self-disclosed HIV statuses were shared with a third party, and the third party also said, well, we don't use this data. But it's just not good enough. It's like you don't want your HIV status to be shared, and you also don't want the fact that you're depressed or you're feeling really, really, really vulnerable at the moment to be broadcast to hundreds of advertisers, regardless of what they do with the data. Are there more questions? Let's wait until we have a microphone, because I think it's recorded, and that's one.
Assuming that not every company is covered by GDPR, what can happen with third-party companies that are not GDPR compliant and located somewhere in Antarctica?
So one of the things that GDPR changed is that it applies to companies, not just companies that are based in the European Union, but also those that process the data or monitor the behavior of people in the European Union. So in theory, it doesn't matter where you're based. If we were able to find your website, and that's why we have a website from New Zealand, by the way, from the UK version, you could argue that it applies to you. But I like your question because it says there are many, many countries around the world that have zero laws. And this research always shows, again, is another tip of the iceberg, kind of. That's what happens in one of the heaviest regulated markets, data regions in the world. We know that, for example, in my Quantcast data at the very beginning, if I go back to this, there was a category when they predicted my gender. We know that the company in the US is predicting ethnicity, and they're not doing this in the European Union because that's considered sensitive. But we know that in the US they're also predicting ethnicity, which raises all lots of questions because it means you could target people by their ethnicity, which could lead to discrimination, etc. Yeah.
No, you covered it.
All right. Do we have more time for a few minutes?
One more question if someone wants to jump in. Okay, we're good, I think.
One at the end. Can we, if there's a woman who wants to ask a question, we'll also take these.
First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It's brilliant. I've actually been following this in a major way myself. About 10 years ago, there was a YouTube video about tracking, about cookies being, people being tracked using their browser history. And nothing's changed. In fact, it's got worse. Mentioned about GDPR, right. As a UK user cannot access certain websites which are based in the US because they're not GDPR compliant. That's one of the restrictions which the UK actually has. Mine isn't not more of a question, it's more to the fact that you've actually highlighted a major problem which can't be fixed. You mentioned about Mozilla Firefox, you mentioned about Chrome browsers. They're designed to track you, especially with Chrome, Google. If you're really, really clever and you use Arch Linux and you're using ad blockers, even those don't block all the sites that you actually visit. Plus, some of the ad blockers themselves are proprietary, and they themselves sell data. So, okay, the question is, what is the perfect solution?
All right, and we have 2 minutes to answer that.
Yeah. I'll hand to you. I'll say two sentences. I think it's more a philosophical question. Do you want the perfect solution? Or if you work in this area, you have to be pragmatist because it's so bad. So anything that improves the situation, I'm in favor of. And I think the law is one way, and it's still too young to say what GDPR's implications will be because there have been lots of complaints that have been filed. We're just still yet to see for what will follow. That said, that's only one part of the element. I think ultimately there are discussions about what's an ethical business model.
I don't think that's something we can answer in a minute and a half. And I don't think there is a perfect solution. I mean, you folks are used to, you know about security. There is no such thing as perfect security. I don't think there is a perfect solution to this. And it's going to be about regulators enforcing GDPR, making sure that everything that is done currently that's unlawful is just fined and properly stopped. And it's also about developing new business models, new way to sustain your websites, But I mean, there are people out there trying to come up with creative solutions to do advertising that don't use any personal data. I mean, one way to do this is just going back 20 years ago and just do contextual advertising, where you're just literally using information about the page, but there is no unique identifier used at any point. So there are ways. There are also some folks out there developing solutions so that you can have targeted advertising happening on your device, so nothing actually leaves your device. I mean, it's a long discussion we can talk about after this session.
Our time is up, but the reason we focus on mental health, because like things need to change, but we need to start with where there's most harm, and mental health, websites about health, anything that's sensitive. The same with political ads. That's where we need to start. Thank you so much.
Thank you.